Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. We will start the webinar in just a few minutes, just waiting for attendees that are still logging on to log on, and we will let you know once we begin. All right, hello everyone. I think we're going to get started now. Welcome to Akumina and ClearBox webinar, Collaborating with Office 365. It's a pleasure to have everyone here today. My name is Janine Markey, and I'm the Vice President of Marketing here at Akumina, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. A few housekeeping items before we begin. We'd like to make this webinar interactive, so we'll be taking questions during the webinar, as well as during the end of the webinar. So we do highly encourage you to ask questions to help keep the webinar interactive. You can submit questions during the webinar using the question box of the control panel of GoToWebinar, or feel free to reach out on Twitter and we'll monitor both. You can reach out either directly at Akumina or ClearBox, or feel free to use the hashtag O365Collab. They're on the screen there if you want to jot them down. The webinar will be recorded, and we will try to send out the recording as well as the slides as soon as possible. I would anticipate probably about 24 to 48 hours after the webinar. I'd like to now introduce our speakers today. We have Sam Marshall, the Director and CEO of ClearBox Consulting, and Troy Trudell, Senior Director of Strategic Alliances for Akumina. I'm going to hand it over to Sam first to give a brief introduction of himself. Sam?
Hi everybody, and thank you for joining us today. So I'm Sam Marshall, I'm the owner of ClearBox Consulting. I've been in the internet and digital workplace field for 18 years now, and for the last 10 years at ClearBox, we've been helping organizations across the UK and Europe to really develop the digital workplace strategies and focus on the people and the business side rather than the technology side. And Troy?
Thank you, Sam. Hi, my name is Troy Trudell. I am the Senior Director of Strategic Alliances at Akumina. I have been in the content management, intranet, and portal space for about 15 years now, and I've been helping our customers and partners make the most of technology to help achieve their strategic goals.
Great, thank you for that. All right, and before we begin the webinar, I do want to just open it up to the audience if we can and do a quick poll. So what we'd like to do is understand, in your organization, which Office 365 applications does your organization routinely use for collaboration? And I'm going to launch the poll here in just a second. And you can select more than one answer, just to make that clear. So you should be seeing the poll on your screen.
I'm going to put my money on email, Troy. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the likelihood.
Give it a couple more seconds. I can still see people clicking through. Thank you to everyone who is voting. Appreciate your participation. All right, Sam. Well, still got a few more. Give it a second. All right, last chance. I'm going to close it out in just, oh, we got one more coming. Couple seconds. I'm going to leave it at a minute. I don't want to.
And we've got one person who's a message saying none of the above because they haven't got Office 365 yet, which is a fair comment.
Ah, fair enough. Thank you. All right, all right, to share the stats with you guys, we had 91% email, 62% SharePoint, 55% Skype or Yammer, 54% OneDrive, and 31% Microsoft Teams. That's actually a fairly good mix, especially with a lot of them at the 50 and 60 range. Not a surprise there at 91% at email. Hopefully throughout this webinar, we can provide some insights and takeaways to start leveraging the power of some of the other tools to help some of you guys listening to the webinar get out of email, because I know that's a strong goal for most of you here today, probably. Okay. All right, just a quick recap what we'll be talking about today. We're going to take a look at the landscape of collaboration tools available in Office 365 and walk through Teams, Office Groups, Yammer, and SharePoint. And we'll walk through each of these tools to review what the intended purpose is, and we'll add clarity to the best practices for each application as it relates around collaboration. We'll also provide you with a framework that you can walk away with and utilize to help your organization and users decide when to use what application. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Troy to kick off the webinar. And I'm going to also hand off control here. Okay, whenever you're ready, Troy.
All right, thank you, Janine. And so, yeah, we're going to take a look at the different collaboration tools in Office 365 today. We're going to take a look at Teams, Groups, Yammer, and SharePoint. And let's begin with Teams. So Microsoft Teams is a chat-based workspace in Office 365. It includes things like activity streams to keep team members abreast of changes, updates, aggregate content across different teams or channels. And I'll get into channels here in a moment. It allows you to chat, allows you to enable different types of apps, share and collaborate on files, use applications like Planner for task management, and really allows you to focus in on different project-based collaboration tools. If we take a look at some of the underlying capabilities inside of Teams, what we're going to see is that you have certain things like activity streams being available for people so that you can understand what's going on inside of your team or your channel. And when we take a look at channels, channels really are segmented areas within inside a team. And Janine, it looks like I've lost control.
Okay. 1 second here.
There we go. It looks like I have it back now. Thank you. So think of channels as being a subset inside of a team where you can segment out things like topics or projects and really have a focus on different areas. So imagine a larger team. Maybe you've got a few dozen team members inside of that team. Inside that team space, you want to have the ability to segment out different work streams. That's a really good use case for channels. Channels are open to everybody who's in that team, but you can segment out those different topics, those different projects, and you can have the ability to have private chats with inside of a team, but a channel itself is going to be open to the entire team to collaborate within. You can extend channels to include things like tabs, connectors to other applications, things like bots, and it really allows you to include all of the cornerstone capabilities within inside Teams itself. Again, think in terms of conversations, files, notes, etc. And when we go and take a look at files and notes specifically, think about, again, files and notes being able to be associated with either larger team. So I might have files and notes in my previous example that I want to share with the entire team, with those dozens of team members. and then I may want to have files and notes that are associated with that specific channel. So maybe there's a topic within inside that team where I want to go in and associate some files and notes around those particular areas. And you can see things like recent files, things that have been shared, uploaded, etc. And if we come in and take a look at things like connectors, connectors are a way for you to be able to bring in other valuable workloads. So think in terms of being able to add in connectors to third-party systems. It may be perhaps it's a marketing system, perhaps it's something like a CRM that you want to bring in data from, and it really allows you to augment the team workspace with information, with content from other applications that are going to add value into those team discussions that are taking place within inside the larger team area, or within inside those channels that you can set up within the team itself. If we take a look at some of the best practices within inside Microsoft Teams, it's really a great solution for sharing ideas, fostering collaboration across that larger team. Really gives you a spot for things like day-to-day team discussions. So maybe in the morning, I go into my sales team. I'm part of the sales organization here at Akumina, and I want to start my day by both understanding what other team members are working on or contributing to those ongoing discussions. Perhaps I've read something recently that would be good for the rest of the team to understand. So those day-to-day discussions can be a great use case within inside of Microsoft Teams. I can use it as a jumping off point to initiate things like calls and video meetings. I can schedule events right through Teams and allow those to be added to the group's calendars, and really have the ability to go in and share assets and provide simple file management capabilities. So perhaps in addition to some information that I found and wanted to post into the team, I've got a document that I want to share and collaborate on with everybody. And it really allows me to do that without having to overload people's inbox in their email account with that type of information, right? I have a spot where I can go in and share that information with the entire team without sending everybody yet another email that they have to go in and sort through and read or file in a folder somewhere. And it's really allowing you to foster that communication between the group, whether it's a couple of team members or a dozen team members that you've exposed that Microsoft Teams interface. That's some of the ways that we've seen our customers utilize Teams to foster collaboration and to do it in a way where you've got a place that everybody can go in, share information, work across those different capabilities in terms of communication, file sharing, project management, all of those tools that typically we're in separate interfaces, you can bring together inside of Microsoft Teams to foster collaboration and really create a central environment for people to work within. And I know we've left things open for questions, so if anybody has questions about Microsoft Teams at this point before we move on to the next topic, we'd certainly be happy to entertain those and chat about those for a minute or two.
So Troy, one of the questions is, are Teams different from Office 365 groups? So maybe one to park when you come onto the group section, which is coming up next. I was just curious to hear what you see your clients using with the connectors, because you had that lovely screenshot of the Kanban board, which looks a bit like Trello and Planner, but was a different system, I think you said. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right, and I think that's a great point that you make. We do see people bringing in things like Planner, certainly, and that's a native O365 tool. But also, bringing in those applications like a Trello. Marketing teams using Trello these days to go in and manage their cards. Say, for instance, if they're collaborating on a marketing event or collaborating on marketing discussions, you don't have to segment that out of the system that your team is used to using. You can consume that into Microsoft Teams experiences, and it's a very open platform to be able to do that within. So whether it's something like a Trello, or again, it's something like you want to bring in, say, Dynamics content or something like that. We see our customers using a lot of the tools that they've already standardized on outside of Office 365 through those connectors because they're used to them and they've been using them for a while. They don't necessarily want to get away from the other capabilities that they've adopted as an organization, but they want to be able to consume that inside of their collaboration space, which is why those connectors are a very valuable part of Teams, because it's not asking organizations to abandon things that they've become accustomed to using. It's allowing them to incorporate those tools, those feeds that they've really been standardizing on into this collaboration space. And again, that's one of the best capabilities of Teams, is being able to bring all of those things together into a single place where people can work, and not asking them that, one, again, kind of push things to the side that they're used to using and add value, and two, not asking them to juggle multiple interfaces because they want to use Teams and other applications. They can really get the best of both worlds and bring all of that together. And our most successful customers really embrace that when they start using something like Microsoft Teams. And back to your first comment there, the next set of content will be around groups, and we'll talk a little bit about where groups fits in and where groups and teams really frankly work together, and where they can provide value as part of an overall collaboration strategy.
Great. We've got a few practical questions coming in that maybe we could just address briefly. So what storage comes with Microsoft Teams? And I guess it's really down to your SharePoint, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So when you stand up a team, you're really also leveraging the power of SharePoint, which I know we'll get into in a little bit, for the storage aspects. And one of the best benefits of that is that because it's using SharePoint, the power of SharePoint, you now have all of the discoverability that SharePoint brings to the table. And that is also one of the differences between teams and groups. I'll get into that in a moment. But think in terms of, if you want to leverage things like discovery, or you want to leverage things like search, you're really able to do those things because that underlying infrastructure, if you want to think of it that way, of SharePoint is the native storage application for Teams. And so it brings to bear all of those and discoverability tools that Office 365 provides, because SharePoint is a cornerstone of that environment.
Mm-hmm. And questions about licensing and cost. So Lawrence, you're saying, is it an additional cost? No, it's included in all the subscription plans, I think, so all the education plans, small business, and the enterprise plans, which is part of its appeal, really. It makes it easy to give it to everybody, doesn't it? Because they've all got access, so long as they've got an Office 365 account for everything else.
Precisely.
Yeah. And then someone asked, are there any notifications when new files, notes, etc. are added? So when you add a file into Teams, there's the option to post it into the work stream for that channel, so people will see it as if it appears like a comment saying I've added a file. But for notes, Troy, so if we use the notebook, which is in effect OneNote in Teams, I don't think there would be a notice about that, would there?
No, it will show up in the activity stream, but yeah, I don't believe that there's a notification outside of the team, like an email or something like that goes out.
I must admit, my personal practice is to mention someone and say, Troy, I've just added a new page to the notebook, if you could review it, and include a web link if it isn't obvious. But the nice thing about the notebook is that it's contained within the team, so generally you just click to the top menu to go to it. And what's the maximum number of people you can have in Teams? Because it's changed now, hasn't it, Troy?
It has. I think, if I remember correctly, it's something like 2,500 from
that's right.
last research. Yep.
It was 999. Microsoft are under a lot of pressure to increase the numbers, which is a little bit odd, because what we're going to go on to talk about is why you would use Yammer instead. But yeah, it's 2,500 now. And is there a reason to save team conversations and documents? So as Troy said, your documents are going to be in SharePoint, so they will be saved anywhere. Anyway, it's just a document library which will be subject to the same retention policies as all your other SharePoint document libraries. But conversations is a little bit tricky. I'm not sure there's a way to kind of create an auditable record of conversations in Teams. Do you know of one, Troy?
I don't believe so. I think think, it is storing those conversations in the Outlook conversation history, but I don't know that you can save at this point an archive of that. I know Microsoft is working on making those areas, and this is part of where they're going to go with groups as well, those areas of the collaboration suite available for things like archiving and searching, but I don't believe that's the case today.
Okay. And the last one, then we better move on. Does Flow work in Teams without buying additional services from Microsoft? So yeah, both Flow and Teams are included in your Office 365 subscription. And there are connectors now between Teams and Flow, or of course you can build a flow based on activities such as adding a document to your SharePoint document library that appears in the team as well. Shall we talk about groups, Troy? Because there's a lot of questions about groups as well.
Yes, certainly. Let me go ahead and advance the slide here. Janine, you may have to do that again for me.
No worries, I can advance. A little tricky here.
Great, thank you. So I've got a couple of slides on Office 365 groups, and when you take a look at groups, there's two core tenets, if you want to think of it that way, that really enable groups to add value to the rest of the collaboration tools inside of Office 365. So think in terms, and I'll get into this more in the next slide, is groups and Microsoft Graph providing the access and connectivity to all of the different capabilities that you're seeing here on the screen. So we've just spent quite a bit of time talking about Teams and all the value that it brings to the table. But there are certainly other tools, and we'll talk about some of them today as we get into things like SharePoint and Yammer. But there's email, there's Skype, and Skype is quickly going to become a very native, and the really only place to consume Skype will be in Teams at some point. But that's also a collaboration tool, if you want to think of it that way. That's back-ended by Office 365 groups, as is services like OneDrive and SharePoint and Yammer. And groups is really kind of an underlying membership model that allows you to have access to all of these different tools and to provide, the capabilities for people to go in and work with these different tools. So, for example, when I stand up a team, it is actually provisioning an Office 365 group in the back end. And if I have an Office 365 group, I can use that as a jumping off point to start a team. And it's really allowing us as an organization, both Akumina as a provider of technology solutions on top of Office 365, and our customers who go in and work across these different workloads that Microsoft has provided. And it gives you the ability to go in and provide access into, and I'll try to advance to the next slide. If not, maybe Janine, you can do that. And it allows you to go in and really treat that group as a true membership service. Because if you think about what a group is, it's taking my identity inside of something like Azure Active Directory, and it's allowing me to then expand that to as the name implies, a group of people. And then it allows me to go in and federate resources. We've looked at some on that previous slide across that group, so that I can extend access into that information. So maybe it's provisioning a SharePoint document library for that group to collaborate within and share information. Perhaps it's using a tool like Planner, again, across that group, so we can go in and have task management capabilities married together with that document. And because it's loosely coupled, you have the ability to bring together these different tools, if you want to think of them that way, in a more ad hoc way. And so instead of having Teams, which is a very powerful tool we just took a look at, that has those various capabilities that we looked at, you may just want to have a document library and the ability to manage tasks. So those are two of apps, if you want to think of them that way, inside of Office 365 that groups have access to. I could just use those two instead of all the other capabilities within inside of a team. It also allows you to go in and bring that information into other experiences. So if you wanted to go into, say, a SharePoint site and bring together, something like a document library and planner, you can do that using groups as a back-end membership service. And then it again, of course, allows you to extend to other applications as well. So think in terms of tools from Microsoft like Staff Hub, or bringing in things like Dynamic CRM, or rich media through things like Stream. And so it's really an authentication and membership service. The Graph API allows you to connect those things together and query that data, and it allows you to be able to go in and be very flexible with the types of experiences that you might create. But again, just to take it up a level, a group really is the cornerstone of how people get access to these different tools, and teams and groups actually work in concert together quite a bit, allowing you to start one from the other, and really allowing you to extend that membership service across your organization into those various, lack of a better word, in those various teams that you want to be able to collaborate with and work with. That makes sense. Any questions about groups and where it fits in as kind of a cornerstone of how Microsoft is connecting all of these tools together?
So one of the questions we had come in, Troy, was do teams create groups as does Planner, as in the same way that Planner does?
Yes, yeah. So if you stand up a brand new team, you are in essence standing up a brand new group as well. And again, vice versa. If I have a group, I can use that as a way to start a team.
And I guess it's worth also highlighting that when you create a team, it does say, do you want to attach this to an existing group? So you don't necessarily get duplication. But my own question for Microsoft is why it seems to deploy so many apps in so many different ways, because sometimes it'd be nice to say, I really do just want this team and I don't want the group with all the other things that you're provisioning alongside it, because then it can start to get very messy, particularly on the SharePoint end.
Yes, yeah, good point. And that's one of the reasons that we leverage groups within inside of our application to allow people to stand up collaboration spaces that don't necessarily stand up all of those apps at the same time. Again, if you want to stand up a couple of different capabilities, maybe I just want a document library and task management through Planner, or maybe I want conversations and Planner without a document library. You have the ability to do that by leveraging a group instead of a team. But you're absolutely right. It is something Microsoft's taking a look at in terms of how can they extend teams to make it more nimble. They've started with that core experience, but it is using groups as that underlying membership service. So I think quickly we'll see Microsoft doing some interesting things with teams that allow you to stand up more lightweight experiences if you don't want to stand up all of those other capabilities at the same time.
Yeah, I think that'd be good. And Antoine Rossard has asked us twice, so clearly they're very keen on an answer. Is it true that Skype Enterprise is going to be replaced by Teams for video? That is official, I believe, now. Yes, that Microsoft has said Teams.
Yes, I did read that announcement.
And behind the scenes, the voice and video conferencing on Teams has always been Skype for Business. It's just about the interface of choice. And I suppose part of the consolidation model for Microsoft is to bring more and more of your routine, quick, high rate of interaction into that Teams environment. And voice and video fits that pretty well, I would say.
Yes.
However, it does feel like now when you want to spin up a video conference, if you also deploy Teams and Planner and a group and a SharePoint site just for that video conference, it's going to get very messy indeed. So I'm sure Microsoft will be addressing that side of things too. Shall we keep going, Troy?
Yeah, I believe that was all the content that I had for groups. I think we should go into our next topic.
Okay, so that's me on Yammer. If I can grab control, please.
I've put the slide over and you should have control now, Sam.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to assume that people are pretty familiar with Yammer as it's been around quite a while. maybe just by way of illustration to talk about one of the strong use cases that I see, which is around Yammer as a place for widespread communities of practice or communities of interest. And a nice case study I saw recently was from British Airways. So they have a lot of flight crew and a lot of engineers who are in aircraft hangars and so on. So really not your traditional desk-based organization. And they've really taken to Yammer as a way to reach out to these frontline workers. One of the things he did when they commissioned a new order for the Airbus 380 jetliner was to post on Yammer a first look with footage and images of what the interior of the cabin looked like. And some of the cabin crew at BA showed a lot of interest in these and said, you know what, we think if you could rearrange the galley so it becomes more efficient. And they actually sketched out a new design for the galley and posted that on Yammer. And the real power of Yammer is that went straight back to the engineers in North Wales, thousands of miles away, and they were able to incorporate these proposals direct from the cabin crew into the design. And I think that's great. You know, in theory, we always had that ability to send out an email or to send it through the chain of command, but in practice, it wasn't working in the fluid way that we see with a tool like Yammer acting as a social network. So Yammer, compared to Teams, superficially, they really are very similar because it's just a threaded group of messages and responses. But Teams tends to be more of that small group, quick back and forth to resolve or to update things, whereas Yammer, its place seems to be settling down more towards widespread question and answer to a much bigger group. And if we think about how Yammer has evolved over time, when Microsoft acquired it, it was a standalone product. And they acquired it just after SharePoint had its own social collaboration feature. So there was a communities feature in SharePoint, which was nowhere near as good as Yammer. So it was born and then almost immediately put up for adoption because Yammer didn't really, Yammer took over and Microsoft didn't really develop that community side. And over the years, we've seen Yammer get a little bit closer and closer to Office 365, but it's still a painfully slow journey. A few times people said, look, do you think Yammer's just going to fade out? And actually, the good news is if you're keen on Yammer, that Microsoft seem to have a renewed interest in it. I think in part because Workplace by Facebook has come along, and Troy, I'll invite your thoughts on that in a minute. But Workplace by Facebook is getting an awful lot of publicity, and I think it's really rattled Microsoft's cage a bit about whether they want to own this enterprise social network space or not. So some of the things that have been announced or have introduced recently, there's voice and video calling within Yammer, so you can set up conference calls and things. The groups thing that Troy has just covered has been aligned. So in the past, you would define a group in Yammer, and that would be entirely separate from groups you might have defined within SharePoint, but now they can be one and the same. And when you uploaded a file into Yammer in the past, that used to be within Yammer's own storage, whereas now you have the option of making that file sit within a SharePoint document library. So that's all good. And the desktop notifications app, the thing that you can install on your Mac or Windows to let you know if you've got new messages, that disappeared for a while and now it's come back. So all these things I think are welcome changes to keeping Yammer a little bit more up to date. And Troy, are you seeing much of a conversation with your clients about whether they should go for Workplace by Facebook or stay with Yammer?
Yeah, I've definitely seen customers making that decision. And I think the funny thing that we've seen is that it's been organizations that have Office 365 but haven't implemented things like Yammer that we're actually even seeing kind of whether you want to call it this or not, kind of rogue Facebook collaboration spaces being set up even outside of Workplace because employees were tired of waiting for a space to go and collaborate, and so they were standing up.
Like consumer Facebook groups have been set up.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's definitely led our customers to look at, well, does Workplace by Facebook make better sense than something like Yammer or groups that we've been talking about? So definitely started driving a lot of conversations, and it's oddly enough forced some organizations that we work with to embrace the collaboration tools in Office 365 more fully, because they see their employees, wanting those types of things. So it's actually driven more adoption into Office 365, but it's also definitely opened up those conversations about what's the correct tool and how do we want to use it with inside of our organization.
Yeah, and I see that too. A few of our clients, they have Yammer, they kind of like it, but the adoption maybe isn't as strong as they would have hoped. So they're piloting Facebook, and the initial indications are that even though on paper Facebook and Yammer are very close, the reaction to Facebook is a lot more positive. And I think a lot of that might just be because people are used to the Facebook interface. So in effect, they've spent years training themselves on using Facebook by doing Facebook posts at home, and then it's a very natural conversion to how it works within Workplace by Facebook as well. So I think it is a real threat. Let's hope that the new Microsoft, who tend to be a lot more open and accommodating to working with Macs and other third-party systems, are also open to doing a level of integration with Facebook as well. Janine, I think you grabbed my pointer, so I'm powerless at this stage, but I was going to mention good old SharePoint, just as that traditional thing, which we couldn't forget, because it still powers a lot of the collaboration spaces, particularly on the formal end that people are working with. And in that poll, I noticed that 60% of people say they use it for routine collaboration. I would have expected that to be higher, to be honest, because SharePoint is so pervasive. But the team sites, particularly within SharePoint, I still see as a good standby for collaboration, which is more document-based rather than conversation-based. And indeed for publishing. So the new publishing sites that have come out in SharePoint are very attractive, and I think deserve consideration when you want to, for example, publish images or a reference site or a event-related site in a way that's a lot more appealing than, for example, uploading a PDF. So now Troy and I have kind of talked about some of the individual tools. I wanted to conclude by looking at how they interact. And this is a slide that Microsoft used at Ignite, and which I saw a couple of weeks ago at the European SharePoint conference in Dublin as well, where they talk about inner and outer loops. And it seemed to get a very positive buzz. And I'm not sure why, because I'm not a great big fan of this slide, but let me explain it first, and I'll try and do it justice. So what Microsoft is saying is that there is an inner loop, which is for people that you regularly work with on core projects. So it might be your immediate project members, or it might be your immediate department. When everybody used to go into the same office, then it was probably the people that you sat with within poking distance with a snooker cue. Then there's the outer loop. So the outer loop are people with whom you connect at more of a distance. So they might be your second degree of separation. They might be people who do a similar role to you, whom you've never met in person, but you know of, and you've probably seen them copied on emails to large mailing lists and so on. Microsoft is saying that when you're doing something intensively and you know everybody really well, you should be using Teams. But when you need extra help and it's not within your immediate field of contact, and you use Yammer to say, can anybody out there help me with this problem? And then gluing it all together, when you need a tailored communication list, then email still has a role, because you can flex that for the specific conversation to say, this is a unique group of people, whereas Teams and Yammer, the audience is always going to be fixed by the group size. Now, my reservation about this is that it kind of implies a strong cutoff between inner and outer loop. Whereas I think in practice, it's a continuum between your inner loop and your outer loop. So if you've ever worked on a really big project, with like 40 people or so, there is no single inner loop. There might be, you're in a work stream with 10 people, and that's your really inner loop. But then there's another 30 people also working on the project who are not the whole organization. You wouldn't talk to them in an open forum, you'd still talk to them in a project forum. So there's a a ring around that. And then that project probably has stakeholders and sponsors who don't want to see all that traffic and day-to-day conversation going on, but again, still want to be more intimately connected with that big project than the organization as a whole. So there's another ring around it. And what I'm getting at is that this split between inner and outer loop seems a little bit like a retrospective explanation, because Microsoft had got into a bit of a pickle by acquiring Yammer and then developing Teams separately. And without wanting to sound like a Facebook fanboy, what I notice in Workplace by Facebook is that they don't do any slide like this. They just say, look, you can have groups, and you might have a group of 10, or you might have a group of 10,000. And yes, they will work in different ways, but it's the same technology, and you don't need to decide up front where your conversation is, other than who is going to see it. Troy, any thoughts on that to add?
No, I think that you've kind of hit the nail right on the head there, and I think you're absolutely dead on with Microsoft kind of, taking a look back at what they've done with their acquisition of Yammer, and now their building of Teams to kind of compete with not just things like Facebook certainly, but things like Slack, and now they're trying to kind of retroactively fit the pieces together and put their thoughts around when you might want to use these things. But I definitely agree with your point there about, you're really going to have both happening in the same space. And I kind of think Teams does that quite a bit with channels, right? Where I might have that larger group project, but inside there, maybe I stand up another channel where I've got, a separate area where I'm just collaborating on a subtopic within inside of that larger project. So, I think that there's a good use for all of these tools, but I do think you're going to use them across those different work groups.
Yeah, the channels model is great, and in a way what you want is that channels model just to keep scaling up to whatever size you want.
Yes.
Okay. So I've got a model for you, which I think will help think through this, because the other reservation I have about that slide is that Microsoft are trying to do like a one-to-one mapping between a tool and a use case, and it just doesn't work. It's not the tool that differentiates, it's how you use it that matters. So there's a piece of research from Cameron and Quinn that was published a few years back called the Competing Values Framework, and they talked about information cultures. And I thought this was really illuminating, because it also informs collaboration cultures. And the headline message is that different companies will have different collaboration cultures, sometimes several different approaches to collaboration, depending on whether you're talking about research and development departments or marketing or finance. And if we recognize that there are different ways of working, then we can make sense of all the Office 365 tools by saying, well, what's the best combination of tools for that work style? So there's two dimensions. You see vertically, we've got sharing and control. So sharing is about the openness, the willingness to let everybody see things, and control is about locking things down and being very careful about things like versioning, for example. And then on the horizontal axis, we have integration versus differentiation. So integration cultures are all about trying to work out the definitive version. They're all about bringing things together and looking for commonalities between information. The differentiation end is more about what's new, open to external things, and understanding what makes our information or our organization unique. So you can plot on this some characteristics. So high sharing, high differentiation, that's your innovation culture. So if I've got a problem and go around the organization saying, what's the solution to this problem? You're probably going to get a response like, oh, yeah, we've got loads of new ideas about that. We haven't tested any of them. Here you go. Let us know how you get on. We're interested in what's new and what's discoverable. But if you have higher control, it tends to be more about saying, here's the unique selling points. Here's what differentiates us from our competition. But let's be consistent. Let's make sure every time we talk to customers and every time we educate internally, we are reinforcing these same points. Then we move over to the integration side. So high control, high integration is where you have a hierarchical approach. It's probably where you've got very well documented processes, where you have versioning and metadata. So if I go to this culture and ask my question, people will say, oh yeah, what you want is process number N311, make sure you got the latest version, and here's the document library where you'll find it. And then lastly, we have the high sharing integration culture, which is much more people oriented. So in this culture, if I ask them the same question, they'll probably say, oh, I'm not sure we've ever written that down, but let's get a coffee and we'll go and talk to Joe. Joe's a good guy, he knows everything. So the interest is much more in integrating people rather than integrating information. So if you look across these, often the tension in collaboration comes not from each different quadrant working their own way, but when different departments try to work together. So when marketing tries to work with engineering, for example, and they feel like engineering is far too process driven, and engineering feel that marketing are far too freewheeling for their liking. And we can map on the Office 365 tools to this framework to start to make decisions about how we might use them. So our hierarchy down here, the high control ones, they're probably the ones who really like SharePoint because it has metadata, because it has versioning. They will like the idea of groups because you can fine tune your access control to say who should see what. And it's all going to be about converging things into a very managed place. Over on the differentiation control side, then the way in which you use SharePoint is probably much more about having that single version of the truth, like an asset library for all your sales collateral. Not so much because they want strict version control, but just because they want to quickly get to the right piece of information to send like the right sales list out to a client, for example. You might see this quadrant using Yammer, but when you do, it's probably in a question and answer format. So it's not that people are really interested in the discussion, but that they want to get the definitive answer quickly, and Yammer can be a very effective way of getting to it, particularly if it's like a curated forum where there's normally one guy who answers 90% of the question. In the top right, when we talk about sharing and differentiation, then this is going to be more conversational. The high sharing cultures probably view SharePoint as a place where documents go to die because they don't like the inertia that comes with control. So they'll use Teams perhaps as a way to do the brainstorming, to rapidly iterate for that very innovative style of working. But they'll also be interested in Yammer if they want to reach out to larger groups. Maybe it's worth saying right now, one of the differences is that Yammer works very nicely with external parties. So part of the characteristic of differentiation is that you probably do want to bring in partners and collaborators from beyond your own firewall. Yammer does that really well. Teams is getting there, but it's not there yet because you can only collaborate with people who have their own Office 365 or Azure account for authentication. And finally, over on the left, remember sharing and integration was all about people, so very non-document centric. Yammer here used much more for conversations to connect people. You probably see a lot more non-work content in there, so it would be more acceptable in this culture to talk about movies and Game of Thrones or the match that happened last night. And also put Skype, though we could say the voice and video conferencing side of Teams instead. But within this culture, quite possibly, many more things would be resolved by having live conversations. And then maybe at the end of it, they might send an email to summarize, whereas the control culture would probably start with the email and only move to the conversational end when they really needed to. And then when it's all done and dusted, move back into something that was more controlled as like meeting minutes and a conclusion. Stitching all of this together, as always, is good old email and Outlook. And I see its role in this model as being the thing that moves across the boundaries. So it might be that these guys say, look, can you just send us one of those assets and so we'll fish it out of SharePoint? These guys might say, okay, well, we'll work it out in our department, we'll have our conversation, but when it goes to engineering, we better just document that. So we'll stick it in a document and send it over to engineering, who will then file it away with a version number and put the whole document control around it. So you'll see that there's no neat matching between one tool and one quadrant. It's much more about saying across the Office 365 tools, how do we deploy them to match the individual working cultures that we see? So we've got 10 minutes left. We're very open to questions, so let's move on over that. And if you do want to post any questions into the question board, Troy and I will do our best to answer them now. Troy, have you seen any questions that grab you?
I haven't, and maybe that's because the chat window for me is not working. So let me go ahead and try to relaunch that real quick.
Let me have a look. So people asking for clarification again about Skype and Teams. So as I understand it, the Skype servers for on-premises, so the Skype Enterprise license that you might run on your own Skype servers, will be supported for a good few years. But what Microsoft has said is that their vision ultimately is that most people will be using Skype as a service that's accessed through Teams. And I think I'm right in saying they've maintained that Teams will only ever be a cloud-based service. So yeah, you wouldn't be doing that on premises. Question just come in saying, how much do you anticipate Office 365 changing over the next year? I mean, oof. Microsoft have huge and ambitious plans, and I'd highly recommend going to the Office 365 roadmap, where they're constantly releasing things that they expect to come out. And yeah, there's a lot in the pipeline. One of the things that's interested me is that they're going to be releasing hub sites to go alongside SharePoint. And hub sites will be a way to stitch together communication and the modern team sites into something which is more like a large audience access point. Troy, anything that you want to add there?
Yeah, I think that one of the most exciting things that we're seeing is all the work that Microsoft is doing with their graph intelligence engine. They're really taking a broad look at graph as being that kind of glue that's going to stick everything together from an information perspective, where you see groups is really that membership service. Graphs is going to be kind of your window into all of the data that sits inside those services, so you can start consuming and exposing that information across all these workloads. So they've even gone and taken a look at enabling graph access to Teams itself. So you can start, not yet, but soon you can start even provisioning capabilities that live inside a team in other areas. So let's say, for example, in a hub site, you may want to surface some activity from a team. Those are things that you're going to be able to do with Graph, and that's one of the most exciting things, because they're really, allowing you to consume, or they will be allowing you to consume all of those capabilities in a way that enables your organization to work the way that you want to. And I think it goes back to that slide that you were just talking about, Sam. Right? Let's take a look at what we're trying to do, and then apply the appropriate tool, not the other way around. And I see Graph as a strong cornerstone of allowing customers to do that.
And Kelly's asked, are you saying that Office 365 groups and teams will replace SharePoint teams and communities? So not from my side, Kelly. I think groups will be the way in which you define membership of SharePoint teams and communities, and teams will become a regular interface into your SharePoint document libraries, but you'll still have SharePoint teams as a more kind of web-based way in which you can go into your SharePoint team sites, and more control over the layouts as well, because the thing about the Teams interface is it is pretty much locked down to seeing those panes of chat and files and so on. And even if you want to, for example, source your files by different metadata, that's a lot easier in the SharePoint interface than the Teams interface right now. SharePoint communities that came out in SharePoint 2013, yeah, I think they are now end of life, and you should be making plans to move that activity over to Yammer or to Teams if you can. We better just conclude, because I've got to look at the clock. Shall I click on for you, Troy, if you just want to say a little bit about what you guys are doing with Akumina and digital workplaces? Sure,
thank you. Yeah, so I mean, we really have built out on top of all of this infrastructure. It goes back to some of the questions even that are being asked, right? Is there going to be a need for SharePoint with the advent of groups? How do I access these things mobily? Is groups the right way to do that? And so what we've built is really, a digital workplace engine on top of those workloads, so that you can speed the adoption of Office 365 in a branded, kind of cross-functional way, right? You have, kind of your traditional intranet, corporate communications driven content alongside of things like document management, alongside of things like collaboration, and you can create those experiences in a highly branded mobile way, and really, bring them all together in a way that's less disjointed than trying to use those tools separately. And so we've built a digital workplace offering that really allows you to take advantage of all of these tools in a way that's more consumable, much like you do in your personal life, across all the different services and data you have access to on something like your own mobile devices. And so we love Office 365 and all the tooling there, and that's why we've chosen to build on top of it and really add value to it in ways that our customers have shown that they want to consume those services and really communicate with their employees and each other.
Excellent, thank you. And to add from our side, we are vendor neutral. We don't sell any tools, so that puts us in a unique position that we can actually look at what's happening in the market. Not everything we do is in SharePoint, but clearly we see SharePoint growing an awful lot. This Monday, so just this week, fresh out on the shelves is our new report, which looks at 34 products that add a ready-made intranet and collaboration layer on top of SharePoint and Office 365, Akumina being one of the examples, but we looked at 34 in total. And if you want to take a note, you can get 10% off that by putting in the code Akumina SPR 18. And I see I missed the N out there, so that should be Akumina, not Akumina. SPR 18, if you go to clearbox.co.uk, I'll put that code on the Q&A panel as well. So thank you. Oops, I overshot. Janine, do you want to do a wrap up?
Yes, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. Again, we will be sending out the recording probably, hopefully by, if not today, tomorrow, so you can look for that in your inbox. And we thank you all for joining and being interactive. We had some great questions as well as just conversation in the chat box. Thanks again, and we will conclude here.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thank you all.